Hello out there in Guitar Modern Land. We're coming up on a new year. I hope you're enjoying the happy holidays, whether it's Hanukkah, Christmas, or just the new year. And I hope you're staying safe and warm in your respective abodes. My interview with Markus Reuter was inevitable as we are connected by so many modern guitar players that he has worked with: Adrian Belew, Tim Moetzer, Mark Wingfield, all of whom I've interviewed as well. He is a musical polymath. He does recording, he does producing, he has invented an instrument. He does a great podcast where he talks to many of these guitar players. He just seems to keep really busy, makes a lot of records, and they're all worth checking out. So I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to check out Red Panda pedals, my sponsor for a long time. They make great pedals, and any modern guitarist needs to have one or more of them. So without further ado, here's my terrific, fun interview with Markus Reuter. Recording also.
Nice. Where are you based? Where do you live?
We moved to France about 2 months ago, a little over 2 months ago. So we're still looking for a place to settle, but at the moment we're in Nepheus, which is outside of Montpellier.
Okay,
And
nice.
yeah, it is nice. It's good to be on this. It makes scheduling things like this so much easier. Since where are you?
Yeah. I'm in the middle of Germany, in
Where's
a
that?
in a place that nobody knows. Well, it's between Dortmund and Hanover is this area. It's the area that I was born, so I'm visiting my parents now. It's a few days before Christmas. This is always like our routine to go visit our parents with our daughter, and after Christmas we'll return home to Berlin. Yeah, I live in Germany, and there was a time when I was thinking I would move to the US, but since joining an American band in 2011, there was no need for me to actually be in the US, if you know what I mean. So
Well, yeah, no, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So you mean when you started working with the Crimson Project, where everybody else is in America, you
yeah,
did
it was
you
it
live over
was
there?
Stickmen with Pat and Tony Levin,
Right. Okay.
and I had started visiting Pat in Austin, Texas in 2005. So we have a long history, of working together. And so between 2005 and 2010, so before I joined Stickman, there was always this idea, okay, should I actually move, closer to Pat, so to live in Austin actually. And once Stickman started working and we were traveling together so much, it was almost a plus not being in the US, like being like the guy coming from the outside and having like some almost like some sort of bonus of not being an American as in associated with America so much. Being the European in the band has really worked very well for me.
It gave you a little exotic aura.
That's what I would have. That's the word that I would have used. Yes.
Yeah. Well, once you're touring, I mean, that seems to be a thing. When people who tour a lot, it really doesn't matter where you live. I mean, and it's funny when I moved to Nashville 10 years ago and lived in Nashville for 10 years. And when I moved to Nashville, it felt like Nashville was kind of like the Berlin of America in that people didn't work, most people didn't work in Nashville. They toured out of Nashville, and because it was cheap to live there, it was near, it was on the East Coast and near a lot of venues. And so you could live in Nashville cheaply and tour all over the East Coast of America, but you didn't actually work in Nashville very much. And I felt from what I understood of Berlin for a long time, Berlin was like that. A lot of artists lived there who didn't necessarily work in Berlin, but it was cheap for a long time to live there, and they would tour out of there. Was that your experience?
That's exactly the way it is. And there's one extra aspect about Berlin which makes it so attractive. It's that, you know, you don't need to be there all the time to be considered to be somebody who lives there. Like in other parts of the world, I've always had made this experience. Like if you're away much, people stop recognizing you as one of their kind, let's say. And in Berlin, that's not the case. And there's so much openness, that like even if you're away for 3 months, you come back, you're still being accepted the same way that you were before you left. And that is crucial, in my line of work, obviously.
Sure, and that's interesting because Nashville is actually not like that. If you're a touring musician out of Nashville, or used to be, if you were a touring musician out of Nashville, they just didn't call you for the studios. You weren't considered someone who could work in the studios, and the people who worked in the studios never left town. But I think that's changing. That's, it's kind of had to, as the work has fallen off in the studios. Some of those guys have to tour, and some of the other younger guys
Yeah.
are into going back and forth, so it works out. But I love Berlin. I mean, the one
It's
time I was there.
yeah, it's also obviously always about the practicalities, like obviously being around is necessary if you want to work as a session musician. You need to be available. So there's always like the fine line, but the good thing about Berlin is that there's very little prejudice when it comes to at least approaching people and trying to make things happen. Like the other thing about Berlin, which is sort of like interesting, is that the as you were saying, like the scene that we are in, like it is not really that strong. And even like the rock music scene is really, really weak in Berlin. So the cliche is correct, that there is electronic music, that there's dance music, that there's party, that there's like still some kind of like rave culture there, which I think really fits very well with what we're doing, but it's a different vibe. It's a different uh, it's a different attitude, and that's why even though I live in such a big, amazing music city, I do still need to travel in order to meet the people that enjoy what I do.
Right. Well,
So,
yeah, the community, and I want to talk to you about this. The community is growing. I mean, I've seen it, for the last decade or so that I've done Guitar Moderne. I've seen it grow steadily, but it's still a niche, for the most part, and it's still relatively small. But it's, of course, it's so much easier to communicate now, and I want to talk about all this. But let's start at the beginning. My experience. I mean,
mhm.
you're the first touch guitar player that I've spoken to in my travels, and I'm curious. You did play guitar. I know you played classical guitar originally, but were you playing electric guitar, and were you tapping on that before you started on touch guitar? What brought you to playing the stick and then to the touch guitar?
Yeah. No, I did not tap on electric guitar. I did play electric guitar. I did play electric bass in high school, and I was in a high school band. And actually, what happened was that by chance, I got into a guitar craft course with Robert Fripp when I was 18 years old. And I had just discovered King Crimson. I saw that there was like a concert by Robert Fripp close by. I went to that show, which was with the League of Crafty Guitarists, and on the tables there were flyers for the course with Robert. And my parents were great. They supported me. I could go to that seminar, to that course. And in my very first personal meeting with Robert, I asked him about the stick because I was curious, only having seen like Tony Levin really play it, in some videos. And Robert was very complimentary about, not necessarily about the instrument itself, but about the idea, the way of playing it. And Robert said that if he, were, still young, he would love to learn it, which kind of was a surprise for me hearing that, uh, you from him. But Robert was only 42 at the time, I think, when this happened. So, but anyway, so he basically said, Marcus, come on, like, why don't you try it? Why don't you do it? And because like Robert also is a lefty, I'm left-handed as well, and we talked about that as well because Robert plays right-handed, I play right-handed, and so we had a kind of like some similarities there. And he said, "Hey, why don't you try the stick?" And just a few months later, I then got a stick from Trey Gunn. Trey had a spare 10-string stick which he gave to me, which I bought from him, and that was how I got into the stick. And like what I have to say is like the the very first time I picked it up, which was actually in this very room, my parents' house, um, I thought like this is so absolutely alien. And I didn't mean alien in terms of the concept, not at all in terms of the concept, but actually physically. And it was
Yeah.
so awkward. It was really awkward. And I in this very room I made the decision, okay, like or I asked myself the question, like, do I really want to do it? If I want to do it, I need to do it properly. And I also need to kind of like figure out how this works. So that's sort of like was the moment when I put on the researcher hat for the first time in my life, saying, okay, this is not just about music. This is also about figuring out how to do this, from the physical standpoint of playing. And yeah, and so then like I played this Chapman Stick 10 and 12 string instruments for about 5 years, so up until like 97 or 98. Then I started using the 8 string war guitar, which is a wonderful like development, you know, also like for me to realize I'm an ensemble player. I'm not so interested in this initially in this idea of having strings doubled so that I can play like one hand has only one set of strings and the other hand has the other set of strings. That was always a little bit too much for me, or even like going too far. And so coming back to 8 string is just one single run of strings, and it's more unified experience. And I've always been interested in because you can tap, and tapping means that you can like you can use the two hands in coordination with each other to play lines and things. So I was more interested in that. So 8 strings were enough for that. And then fast forward another like almost like 8 to 10 years, actually during another meeting with Robert Fripp at a festival in Portugal where we both played. I went out to have coffee with him, and he asked me about Marcus. What I mean, because he knew that I was one of the few lifers, as he calls us, coming out of guitarcraft, and and he said, Marcus, how do you do it? And blah, blah, blah. And as I was explaining to him, I realized how much like just purely idealistic things I was doing and spending my time on. And as a result of that conversation, I was asking myself, okay, what can I do? How can I do create something like an object that is an embodiment of my knowledge, let's say. And that turned out to be what then turned out to be the company Touch Guitars, and the first model, the U8 Deluxe, which was created in collaboration with a luthier in Austin, Texas. And so that's how I ended up with the Touch guitar.
Right. Oh, I definitely wanted to ask you about that because, I mean, so obviously you moved from the stick in part to the war guitar because you only needed you didn't want the 10 and 12 strings. And I also assume that the guitar aspect of it felt a little more comfortable, but not comfortable enough. And so that was, from what I understand, was the research to actually make an instrument like that felt more comfortable on your body. And what else
Yeah.
was it about? Did you put into the war guitar, to your guitar, the touch guitar, that you were missing in the other two instruments?
Yeah. You see, like you are absolutely right in saying that what was attractive about the war guitar, not just that the word guitar is in the brand name, right? War guitars. It was also that it actually didn't, I mean, the psychological aspect of like the novelty aspect of the stick, I think was detrimental and still is detrimental to people actually learning to play it. And I know this is something that we kind of like know about in our scene, like if we're just talking about musical gear, right? Where yes, maybe there's something that that like a piece of gear that is by no means a one-trick pony. But what happens is that people use it just like a one-trick pony,
Mhm.
right? Because they never go beyond, like, because they don't want to dive in, they don't want to learn, or they don't have the time to learn or something. So then these objects, the gear, or also in the case of the Chapman stick, it kind of like becomes a sort of like an excuse, you could say, or a way into like not really becoming familiar with what you're dealing with. And that was something I realized from the very beginning. The very first time I met other stick players was that they hit like a ceiling so quickly, and it was on one hand, yes, it was physical, but there was also like the psychological aspect, the novelty aspect that made them stop really wanting to learn it. And so with the war guitar, that hurdle was already removed. And I wanted to go even further. The war guitar was, so you could say, like, what is the difference between Marcus' touch guitar and the 8-string war guitar? Biggest difference is the way that it feels when you touch it. The war guitar feels like a modified bass guitar, right? It has that substance, it has the size, it has the weight, it has the string tension. Like the U8 instrument that I came up with feels like a guitar, like a bigger guitar. You could say like a baritone, right? It's kind of like it's more compact, and it is very light to play it. It is very sensitive to the touch. It's very traditionally a guitar instrument, as it does make an acoustic noise. It's not something that is trying to be that is sort of like trying to have and I think you know what I mean when I say this, like a pre-produced sound, or pre-produced, uh, almost like sort of like a built-in compression, or a built-in, like the stick has like this built-in sound, which is amazing. But that's what it is. There's that one sound, and it's very hard to get out of that. And so I wanted to have an instrument that is like a totally like an empty canvas kind of thing, that feels more like a guitar, that's very easy to play. Um, that like if you'd ask a luthier, you could explain all the details, why they're there, how they work, and it's all very traditional. And that was kind of like my thought process. And back then, I also wanted to eventually make this kind of instrument available for a much cheaper price, which turned out to be a very difficult thing to do. And nowadays, fortunately, we're getting closer to that. I'm not no longer operationally involved in touch guitars in the company. But there's now like an instrument that's being built in Poland that's much more affordable than the totally hand-built instruments. And sometime soon, there's probably even going to be like um, a really, really affordable economy line of instruments that's going to come out of Asia.
Well,
So
yeah, it's funny. I was going to talk to you about that because I looked at the website and I saw that, the deluxe is $5,000, and even the simpler one now is $2,500. And I know,
yeah,
I've written articles about this, about how guitar players are horribly spoiled in terms of, what they spend for their instruments. And your average serious musician on any other instrument spending $5,000 is nothing for an instrument, for the most part. I mean,
yeah.
if you play piano, you play saxophone, you play upright bass, any of that stuff, you're going to pay way more than that. And I was curious. I mean, it seems that the touch guitar is doing well and did well. And I was curious if you thought that people are willing to spend that money, because you have to be a more serious musician to even attempt to play that kind of instrument. This is not something you pick up to play, Louie Louie or Trog's tunes on, or punk, or, stuff like that. I mean, you're committed.
Yeah.
You can, but you're committed to music if you're going to play this in the same way I think a pianist or a classical musician is. So therefore, you're maybe more willing to spend the money for the proper instrument.
Yes, you know what was sort of like the big question mark for me, and something that I really had to learn over the years, is really to understand that a precision tool, and that's what a great instrument is, right? Like a precision tool is not something you can actually produce for little money. It is kind of like it's a contradiction, right? So what I'm saying now is, like, if there will be, say, an affordable instrument that can be contest like something like $500, $600, something like that, right? That would and that works, because that's the main aspect. It needs to work. Like an electric, you can build electric guitars, or people can buy electric guitars for $80, and those guitars work because it's okay to have an action like, 3, 4 millimeters. It works when you're playing guitar. So it doesn't matter if the frets are really like,
Right.
set up
Right. Right.
precisely. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, it's very different.
but with a touch instrument, you need to have that precision for the instrument to actually work. And so that is the crucial point. And that's where I hope that Stefan, who's running the company now, will find a solution to get like enough quality and precision going with the instruments so that they will actually work, and be affordable. And that's really the aim.
Well, it's easier. That too is easier than it's ever been. I mean, I think if there's a time that it'll be possible to do that, it's now because I mean, I just watched a video about Paul Reed Smith is about to bring out a DTG SE. You know, David Grissom, which for me is that's the best
Mhm.
Paul Reed Smith ever made, and they want to do an SE version. And the SE versions of the Paul Reed Smiths for years have been really quality instruments. I mean, they've been, in terms of playability and scarily close to, the $5,000 full on. I mean, it seemed to me in a lot of ways the only difference was the full on S. Paul Reed Smith had the fancy wood and the fancy inlays, but in terms of I've played a bunch of SEs and they're perfectly playable instruments. They're not $80, they're $700, $800, but if there was ever a time to be able to do an affordable touch guitar, it's there. A lot of it seems to be how willing and able you are to stay in really close contact with the Asian company that's building it, and be able to go over there regularly and be in touch regularly and, go back and forth regularly and really stay on the quality control. But if you do that, I mean, the craftsmanship seems to be in these places and they can do it. And it seems like more and more people are interested in playing this kind of instrument.
Yeah,
So it would be great if it was affordable, even as something that could be something to start out on and then move up to a
yeah,
higher
exactly.
priced instrument. I was curious, you started on classical guitar. Did that help you, that two-hand independence help you when it came to the stick and the touch?
So, certainly. I mean, I'm not saying that I had the two-hand independence kind of like down in a like really deeply, or but this 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 it was actually more the classes with Robert Fripp that really prepared me for that. Yeah, because they're in Robert Fripp's teaching, there's a lot of like learning to clap polyrhythms and play polyrhythms with other people, so you're learning to hear them, and that was like even like a better preparation than playing classical guitar in a way. Because in classical guitar, this is like something that I actually do love, is that the two hands really operate as a unit. It's like it's only, well, only, but like mostly with electric guitar, where people assume that the hands operate separately, which also it's not true. We know that, right? But there's sort of like an illusion somehow. But with classical guitar, like you're massaging the strings, you're operating the strings with both hands at the same time. And you have independence here, you have independence here within the hands, and you have the independence between the hands. The difference, though, is with the touch instrument, where you're not exciting the string anymore with one hand and you're fretting with the other.
Of course.
The fretting finger is also the finger that shapes the sound. So first of all, obviously the attack, the level of dynamics, right? That can only come from that one strike with the finger. And then like the note itself, like how does it bloom? What kind of movement does the finger make on the string to make it bloom? Not even talking about vibrato or anything, just the fact of like how do I keep the wave going, let's say, like as
Right.
the natural sustainer that we have with our hands, with our fingers. And then like, okay, then now I need to stop the note. You only have that one finger to stop the note. And then you have 4 fingers per hand, and these fingers can be seen as individual guys, let's say, trying to play notes, or you can see them as a group that has to interact somehow to make things work. And then if you see when you then widen that concept to include the other hand, right? And then you can have the two hands wide apart from each other. So even mentally, they are separate units, or you bring them together physically or mentally, and they start forming one unit that has 8 fingers, right? And like so, and I was really very well prepared by my classical guitar teacher. I also had a classical piano teacher in my teens. I had a great composition teacher, and I had Robert Fripp. And so I was really very well prepared for the stick, and also to be prepared to kind of like conceptually unlock it, because there are so many questions about it. And I was young, I was stupid. I went out and met people and asked them, how do you do it? And very few people could give me an answer. And it was really shocking. Like even like a question like, how do you play a soft note? How do you play a loud note? Um, Back then there were still like some really stupid myths about that out there, that some people called that technique a staccato technique. Just, I don't understand. I don't know what you mean. Like, are you talking about the attack? But you can just leave the finger on the string and the note sustains. So it's not a staccato technique, right? And stuff like that. And then realizing that, like, it sounds stupid, but I was one of the first people who said, well, the dynamics is in the speed of the finger. It's the velocity. Like how? If you bring the finger down faster, you get a loud note. If you bring it down slowly, you can bring it down very slowly, push down the string, you don't hear anything. And so it's in the velocity. So there's one technique or facility that we need to practice, is to accelerate the finger at all sorts of different speeds. And once you kind of like have that sort of insight, then building exercises, around that is much easier. But you need to understand in the first place how the note is actually, you know, so what physical action actually makes the note. So
Well, yeah, of course, and
I
that
think I went very,
no, that should be that's something that
uh,
should be we would think should be self-evident. I mean, but it's guitarists as well don't understand that. I mean, there's so much more to playing just a regular guitar than just picking the note and putting your finger down in the right place. I mean, and the great guitarists know that, and there's a range of, an almost infinite range of dynamics between how you pick it and how your left hand goes down, all of that kind of stuff. But I could see how that would be magnified on something like the stick, where you're not actually picking it, so you don't have two things to
yes,
cover that. You just have the one thing. I was curious to say, I mean, I love the design of the touch guitar. It's really simple but elegant, and it has a great look to it. I was curious why, and I think I know, but why you move the controls from where they would normally be below the bridge, vis-a-vis going down from your head and to above the bridge. I mean, is that because it's slung kind of low like that, the way it's, the way you pull the neck up to almost like you're playing an upright bass? So if you put the controls in a normal place, they'd be farther away, obviously.
yeah,
But I'm assuming they don't get in your way where they are now.
exactly. Exactly that. You basically answered the question already. It's if you bring the cool thing about the touch guitar is that the where the belt uh, hooks are located on the instrument. If you use the strap correctly, you can put the instrument at any angle. It could be like a regular guitar wrist angle, or it can be up like an upright, as you say. And the idea is simple. You don't, because the right hand um, does play all does play all the strings, as does the left hand, right? So that means the left hand is sort of like reaching over this way over the fretboard. So now if you bring your hand down, and then you have to reach over all of the strings to get to the controls, that's just awkward. So it just makes much more sense to have it closer to you, no matter if you're using it in a guitar position or in an upright position. So that's why that was like a no-brainer to put the controls there. And that was also that for most guitars, war guitars, Mark War also did that for the war guitars. makes total sense.
I guess I mean, well, you say you're a lefty who plays righty, but lefties who flip right-handed guitars over end up with the controls on the top, and for them it can occasionally be a problem of hitting, knobs with their left hand. But since I guess since you're not picking, you're not doing that kind of motion, it's not as much of an issue, even if you put it in.
Yeah, exactly.
So so let's get to your records. There's quite an output there. And the first solo record is billed as ambient, which some of it could be thought of as ambient in the Eno sense. But if you take a tune like Womb of Glass, it might shock people who think of ambient music as something entirely lacking in any kind of aggression. So how do you think about ambient music?
Mhm. Like for me, it's always a struggle to assign genres to whatever I'm doing. So like I come from musically, I come from the contemporary classical world, let's say, of 20th century European classical music. I've been exposed to Stockhausen, like even Boulez and stuff like in the 70s, like as I was growing up, things like that were on public television, right? And public radio. And so when I started making music, where I realized like I had a 4-tape TIAC or Tesca, I can't even remember now, and I was doing like like what I would now call ambient music, but it was like harmonically, it was always something that fell into like a contemporary classical sound. Like for me, there's no such thing as consonance and dissonance. It's for me, it's like a playing field, right? And I don't use those terms, and everything is like a continuum anyway somehow. And so ambient music for me really is music that it's a personal definition that I can enjoy as an actively listening to or passively listening to. And so it's very funny to say this, but when I first learned about King Crimson's music, for example, I did listen to it quite a lot as ambient music in the background. Like I remember Locks, Tongues, and Aspect. Like it didn't click with me when I listened to it actively, but I listened to it in the background, like while I was like programming my computer or whatever. I can't remember exactly, or doing homework, and then suddenly, yeah, then suddenly there it was. And that's really like for me, any music can be ambient. Any music can be used as an ambience, and so like all these definitions, they don't really make that much sense for me. So it's more of a marketing consideration,
Well, it is, and I want to discuss that at some point. But also, yeah, we'll take as a given that genres are pointless and used mostly for marketing. But even given that, up through the first string unit record, it seems like your record seemed. I mean, what I would add to maybe typical ambient music is the lack of beats, long tones. And there was a lot of that
Yeah.
on your work up until the string unit record, which
Yes.
where all of a sudden, you're playing with a violinist and everybody is playing more notes and there's more harmony and there's more movement. So what created that shift at that point in your career?
I think it was the opportunity, really. The thing is like just as I said, I'm just interested in music. I just love music. I love experimentation. I love long note. I love short notes, many notes, few notes. I don't care. So for me, it's pretty much about opportunity. Like who do I play with? Um, what is the framework? What is the context? And then anything goes. And ending up like actually playing with Tony Levin, right? For example, um, I did have like when I first heard the intro to Elephant Talk, I had the feeling of okay, that is my family, right? Like I heard something that was, I remember my thoughts were, oh, there's somebody or there are some people that are making the music that I would like to make. And so, but then ending up playing rock music at very loud shows with those guys, this was never something that I had planned. It's just that I'm sort of open to make myself available to whatever opportunity I have, and then I'm trying to do my best in that situation. So with playing with Dagobert Böhm and Zoltán Lantos on string unit, that was like not really the first time, but that was like a moment where I could be in an ensemble, in a small ensemble, and actually write for people. So there were like parts written for other people as well, and it was not just improvisational. And that's really where things move out of, as you say, like the ambient, just long notes kind of thing. And sort of like at the same time, my band Zentrozone, with Bernhard Wüsteheinig, which is an improvising band, where I was like the experimental guitarist, right? But also there, it was very much um, about creating composition rather than improvisation. So the consideration of form was always present in those experimental explorations. So, and in that sense, I personally never experienced it as experimental music because it was never meant to be an experiment in its presentation, but it was meant to be presented as this is what it is. It may be the result of an experimental process, but no, this is like if I start playing like uh, what other people would consider a jazz guitar solo on top of my ambient back backing track, then that is what happens, and it's not something like, as you say, that's bound by genre considerations or by uh, like by anything restrictive. But there was always the openness, and I was so lucky that I had discovered artists like Mike Oldfield or David Bedford, David Torn. Even before I discovered Robert Fripp, I was listening to David Torn, and then Robert Fripp, and all these Brian Eno, all these open-minded people. Um, so for me, moving forward from there was based on opportunity, and like the next step there was actually meeting Pat Mastelotto and starting the duo Tuner with him. And that's when things got really concrete. That's when when I was allowed to be a real bass player, that was allowed to play guitars, also acoustic guitars on the records we did together, where I was allowed to use my voice, where I was writing lyrics. And so I was moving further away from my initial ambient um, explorations. And it's just because I love music. That's really the ultimate answer there.
Well, yeah, and obviously you're open to a lot of different kinds, and this is something I've discussed with a lot of musicians, because it's there's there for years there was a big difference between America and Europe. Was that in Europe musicians were much more open to just putting any kind of music with any other kind of music in any kind of context. In America, even free jazz, quote unquote free jazz, you weren't allowed to play a melody if you're playing free jazz, or if you're doing free improvisation, you were not allowed to have a beat in there or a melody. There was
Yeah,
there were
yeah,
almost stricter rules about quote unquote free improvisation than there were around pop music.
yes,
And in Europe, I think it's and more everywhere. It's become a thing of, and obviously in your music, it's always been a thing, but has become more and more so, where the music just reflects all sorts of different kinds of music. Just getting into gear for a minute, live, use a laptop live. I've noticed. Is there a reason you prefer that to pedals, and how do you use it? I'm curious.
no, the laptop was never. I never used the laptop for the generation of the basic palette of sounds. I always use a floor-based unit to create the sounds. The laptop is merely for looping.
Okay.
And because I have about 15 years ago, I came up with my very own process for looping that I can only do in my laptop. It's using like a feedback matrix and automation and stuff, which really no floor-based unit can do. So that's why I'm still having the laptop on stage. But I'm not a fan of letting the laptop be the main unit. I mean, it's nowadays it's quite possible and it wouldn't make any difference. But I love I still love the idea that there is as like in any music production process, you have different stages. Like, okay, like I have my hands, I have the strings, I have the guitar, I have the guitar cable, I have the volume pedal, then I have another cable that goes into, and then it starts. Like what is the order there? Like you can have all sorts of, you can also have the volume pedal set located somewhere else in the chain, and all of these things. And nowadays, well, yeah, about a year ago, so I started using the Neural DSP Quad Cortex because it really does everything that I ever dreamed of. But even I remember having those dreams even in 1993 of a device that does the things that I can do with that now. But I love this idea of having separate units for separate functions. And I also initially, this is not the case with the neural DSP thing anymore, but I like the idea of combining pedals and sounds from different brands because that's like where you can find your own sound. Like maybe it's difficult to get a different sound from from a pedal that everybody uses. But if you combine it with something else where people think it's useless, this is something that we quite, you know what I mean, hear quite
Sure.
often that the pedal is useless, right? It's
Yeah.
useless to get that sound that everybody knows. But if you want to do something new, and then you combine that pedal that's useless with some other pedals, and you get something really quite wonderful, And
So
that
you're using the neural DSP now, or are you still using that with pedals? You're using the neural DSP more for your amp tones rather than, and then using pedals with that?
Yeah, in the studio, I'm freely I have a huge pedal collection, and I use whatever I want to use, and I'm trying to never use the same combination of pedals twice in order to like get inspired to do something new, right? The Neural DSP is just a blessing for life work, and since like this year alone, I played 50 shows with Stickmen, and I remember schlepping like really like 30 kilos of stuff around, and now that's down to like maybe 6, and it makes a huge difference. And that's why, like I'm absolutely fine with that, and I don't need the flexibility or the creative freedom to find a new sound for every night that I'm on tour.
Right.
But when I'm in the studio, when I'm recording at home, I'm just freely combining stuff all the time. Like in the summer, or like I think in May or late in April, I got um, the Habit pedal. I don't know if you that delay pedal, which is wonderful, which I then used throughout all the recordings I did in the summer. But ever since then, I haven't used it at all anymore. And maybe it's going to take me like 5, 6 years until I'll use it again. That's kind of like how I am. I sort of like even have a memory of which gear I use for which recording, even which guitar I use for which sound. And but I actually memorize it, so I'm not doing the same thing again, which is kind of wacky, but
No, it makes sense. It's like Eno, when he got his DX7, refused to write down any of the settings that he came up with, so that he wouldn't
yeah.
use them again. So is your looping based in a MaxSpace thing that you built yourself, or is it based in the stuff that's already in Ableton, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's like anything you need is built into Ableton these days anyway. So I remember initially I used Ableton as the shell, and I used the Mobius loopers. I don't know if you remember those
Yeah,
little
sure.
plugins. Yeah. So I used the Mobius, and the way that my looping setup works is like but anyway, like now you have those loopers in Ableton. Like I can't remember at which version they introduced the loopers. So everything's there. You have the LFOs there. You have the automation there. Everything's there. You have the ability to create a feedback matrix. So I don't need any Max or Max for Life to do what I need to do.
Right.
And so basically, like what I do is I still, I've experimented a lot over the decades. So, and it turns out like two loopers is all I need to get maximum complexity. Because if you go into cross feedback between two delays or two loopers, you're opening up the door to infinity right away. And so adding more loopers into that doesn't make a difference. So that's why my system is very simple. It's just a 4x4 matrix. It's two looper channels and two effects channels and one input channel. So then on those, the 4x4 is a matrix, and the matrix is automated. So I have different presets that I came up with of automation where things kind of like crossfade into each other slowly, or have slow crossfades with glitches, or I have like rhythmic patterns, or a combination of the three, So that's sort of like uh, just a very quick rundown. But the beauty of that is that because it's not a looper in the traditional sense anymore. So like any consecutive repeat is sort of like morphed a little bit.
Right.
So it's never the exact same thing twice. And if you're getting into this, like also this, like I said, this glitchy and like cut up kind of thing where like cut up is taking from loop A and then fed into loop B, and then the same process happens from B to A. It's basically like you're reshuffling the content of the loopers, and especially with ambient, like long notes, it's a wonderful thing because you get these textures that are just so deeply, um, you could say mathematically or organically structured, that they sort of like represent some sort of universal truth. Uh, that really is independent of what the player puts into it. So, and it gives you a lot of freedom to compose where you see, okay, there's like a musical, it's almost like a musical partner in the computer that, who helps you, who plays with you.
Right. Well, yeah, it becomes almost like aleatory music and but are you using clips for the automation, like dummy clips to automate the loopers, or
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And I was one of the very first people to do that, like in 2005 or so. And once they introduced the loopers and stuff in Ableton, like the system was complete. And the dummy loops, and back then I mean, you still have to do it, I guess. I had to use like an empty audio file or just short one, and to make these dummy clips. And
Right.
yes, and because you can't automate the send and return the return tracks, you can't automate them. You can't have clips on those. So that's once I figured out, okay, all I need to do is route them back onto the mixer, and then I have my dummy clips on them, and then I can have like my perfectly balanced matrix, just like an old-fashioned analog mixer, right?
Yeah.
And but with the digital automation, and it's amazing. I've been using this since I think I played the first show with that system. I still remember it was the 1st of March 2005. I was opening for Richard Barbieri in London. That was the first time I used that system, and it crashed. That's why I remember.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the joy of using computers. Although I have to say, for the most part, the Max, the computer doesn't crash. Live can be occasionally. Ableton can be at various stages, has been more and more or less stable. But for the most part, that's been
Yes.
stable. I mean, yeah, I was using a whole other system using this iConnect audio interface that was supposed to be able to interface my iPad with, use that as a effect send and return in Ableton. And when it worked, it was amazing. I mean, I could send any track into the iPad to be affected by all those amazing apps that you can get. but it rarely worked. It would crash just regularly. But live, I'm curious, how do you integrate the laptop into your system? In other words, if you're using the neural DSP, then are you running everything into an interface into the laptop and then out of that into powered speakers or the house?
Yeah. So this is really amazing now with the neural DSP. Something because as you know, like even the Helix, and I used the Helix for a long time, and I loved the Helix. Okay, but what was like the problem with the Helix in the long run was its weight, and also the fact that the built-in audio interface didn't work the way that I wanted to. Right. So now with the neural DSP, it's amazing because it has, I don't know, 6 outputs or something, but I only need four. So I use the main outs to send out the guitar, the sounds that what's coming out of my guitar basically. So the main guitar outs. And then I can send a copy of that internally to the laptop just via a USB cable. So the neural DSP is connected via USB to the laptop, and then from the laptop, I'm sending the process signals from the laptop, the loop stuff, back into the neural and send that out to the secondary outputs, secondary stereo outputs.
So the
So
neural you're using is a piece of hardware. It's not their software within Ableton.
no, I'm using the hardware, and
Okay.
that's what makes it so amazing because like the hardware is independent of the laptop. But the laptop is connected via USB and is sort of like an extension of the brain, you could say. Plus, the hardware has the extra outputs. So it's like the smallest setup I've ever had. And it literally, I mean, it does fit in a laptop case. The Neural DSP hardware, my little Dunlop volume pedal, like maybe a like an electroharmonic synth pedal, like which I use, and that's about it. And so I can travel extremely light, just a guitar case and my laptop case, and that's all I need. And it weighs less than 5 kilos, the gear I'm schlepping. And the amazing thing is like because I used to and I still use Focusrite interfaces. I really like the sound of them. Um, but I don't have to use it live anymore because all I need is the USB between the neural hardware and my MacBook. So,
Yeah, it sounds ideal. And in this day of flying nightmares, it's becoming more and more necessary. I just did a column for Electronic Musician on why people who are really into electronic music should play guitar. I mean, if you're a guitar player, why stay with the guitar? And the touch guitar seems to be in some sort of sweet spot between playing a keyboard and playing a guitar. But I'm curious, for somebody who is an electronic musician, in many ways, what do you get from using that kind of touch response instrument that you feel you wouldn't get from playing a keyboard synth?
yes. Um, and this is like an amazing point because I have been asking myself this question ever since I started making music. Uh, the string is is uh, is like an antenna that picks up who you are. It is it. I mean, and like I'm talking to you, so like that's the difference. Like you can't ever have uh, a keyboard instrument that does that because there's a translation process happening that takes away the initial touch, the initial connection, the initial the sweat even, right? Uh, Also, because the string is vibrating, and it while it is vibrating, it still picks up new vibration. So it's not that it ends when you start the note. It actually starts when you start the note. And any movement, any thought you have, any change of your physical being and mental being is being transported into the string. It's as simple as that. So for me, making electronic music with processes that take the input from a string is the ideal electronic music, and it's the only, for me, the only electronic generation of sound, let's say, that feels satisfying to me. It's I mean, in an ideal, I mean, I do make music that does not use any guitars, right? So like, I have to say that, and I enjoy that as well. But the ideal situation is that you have a string, you have a vibrating string that you can control or not control, not be in control of, even though you try to be, uh, as the oscillator, and that's the whole beauty. And so, for me, and this is wacky. So playing like one of those, like what is it called? What was it called in 90s? GR33, or like the Roland
Yeah,
synthesizers,
synthesizer.
MIDI, yeah. So even like playing one of those horrible vocal choir patches from that device via a string felt better than pushing a key on a what was it, JV 1000 or whatever it was called. I don't know the
Yeah.
equivalent keyboard with the same sounds. There's really a big difference, and it has to do with intention. It has to do with connection, and like, I mean, I there are so many instruments out there nowadays that are using the idea of touch. So even if it's not a string, like I see so many people playing around with nails in a board where they're making connections with their fingers,
Right.
and that is kind of like, that is also wacky to me, because I see like, okay, that is just sort of like you're betraying yourself in a way to try to make it purely an electronic that's an electronic contact, and that you can't really compare that with the analog life of a string and a magnetic pickup picking up vibration, really. So that's something completely different. But anyway, like, I'm all for that, and I'm an advocate of people, at least experiencing the difference uh, between pushing a plastic key and actually fretting a string.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a Sakamoto video recently of some piece that he was doing or some performance, and he was actually playing guitar for part of it because, it just seems like at some point he decided he's a renowned and historic keyboard, legendary keyboard player, but at some point he decided the only way I'm going to get the sound I'm looking for is by exciting the strings of a guitar. But while we're on synthesizers, my next question was, you work with a lot of synthesizer players, J. Peter Schwam and others. And
Mhm.
when you do that, how do you approach fitting your sound? Because as we know, synthesizers take up a huge swath of sonic space. Keyboards in general always have, but
Yes, yes, yeah.
synthesizers even more so. How do you work on fitting your slotting your sound into the mix when you do that?
hmm So I think it very much, again, it depends on the person you're working with. But in the case of Ian Boddy, who's the first guy, synth guy I started working with in '99, I think, uh, he was so in love with the textures that I was creating from the guitar strings. So that I gave him samples of my guitar, of like soundscapey sounds, also individual notes. And so the question for me was not anymore, how do I make myself fit into his thing, but he started using my sounds as part of his setup. So he sent my loops through his Roland whatever 100 modular, uh, you know, and chopped my loops up. So it was very interesting for me that from the very beginning, I didn't have to ask myself the question, like, how do I make myself fit in context? Because people were embracing what I was doing so much.
Well, so that either they could fit around you. I mean, it just sounds to me what you just described sounds like an even bigger nightmare because trying to fit, if you're playing along with that, trying to fit your sound into you, I mean, and differentiate it could be difficult. But I know what you're saying. So if they, I mean, if they are embracing what you're doing, then it kind of becomes their job to fit their sounds around your sound. I mean, and in any kind of collaboration, it's a back and forth
Yes.
thing. But
Yes. Yeah, you used the word differentiation just now, right? And I think, at least from my perspective, music or producing music is more about the opposite of differentiation. For me, it's the synthesis. It's kind of like embedding sounds. I think the like different um, unmixing, let's say, like a lot of mixing that people do is actually unmixing, trying to separate the parts, right? Making them more audible and stand out and stuff like, which I totally appreciate. I mean, I get that, and it's great, it's wonderful. But from my my artistic viewpoint, though, is that even if I am separating the sounds, I want them to connect. I want the textures to do this, right? To interlock in ways that makes this the whole sound like something that's satisfying to me. It's a bit like very much like preparing food. Like you could have amazing ingredients, right? But if they don't taste greater than the sum, right? Like there's no point. It's not satisfying. And that's where I'm coming from in collaboration also. Like it's pointless for me if there's no integration happening. So that's why I'm not even concerned. You're absolutely right. I remember that very first album with Ian when he asked me to play a solo on top of this amazing track that he built from my loops, right? I said like, I mean, I can't possibly find a sound that kind of like is as good as what we already have, right? And and I like listening back to that very track, I can still feel that I'm a little bit dissatisfied with it. So like I know what you're saying, but I love the challenge and like working with Jan Peter Schwan, for example, also he's a genius guy, all right? Like it's more about the process, as in the process of working together, as well as how people work with audio processes. And what I mean, you know what I mean by that. Like, so Peter works with an analog desk also. So he sends his stuff through an analog desk, and he has outboard gear connected, and he can send stuff through an Eventide processor, and that goes back, and you get like feedback. You get all of the things that you can only really easily get with analog gear, and that's where we connect. That's where the textures connect. That's where the process connects, the attitude connects, and that's what that is about. Like with Robert Rich, for example, another really outstanding musician, unbelievable actually, so great. Um, we just we just connect on a conceptual level. We're both experimental. Um, there is an album we did together, which was called "Lift a Feather to the Flood," where we improvised with guitar and piano, and and all of his piano tracks are pitched down an octave, like it's so half speed after the fact. And it's amazing how this, like, even like as you're creating the music, you don't even know what form it's going to take later, but you realize because the two musicians, they have mutual respect or even love for each other, like it just totally reflects in the music. And it's a little bit like what I said about the string, like the guitar string. Everything kind of like flows together there and becomes inseparable and makes sense. And you don't need to think about like how can we make this work in the mix, or because it already works from the get-go somehow. Does that make sense? I mean,
yeah,
like
absolutely. Well, yeah, what I focused on when what you were saying was fascinating because you use the word integration, I use the word differentiation, and then you mentioned cooking. And the thing is about great cooking is when somebody makes a dish where at the same time you can taste all the different flavors that are in it, which is differentiation, but at the same time they all work together to make something greater than a whole, which is integration. And I know, I mean, some of my happiest and weirdest and scariest times have been playing on stage with people. Like I played in a band with a pedal steel player who learned to play pedal steel because he thought it would sound good on King Crimson tunes, and we were doing this kind of avant pop thing, and there were times when I couldn't tell who was playing what because we were both using effects. And I had played country music and had a lot of pedal steel kind of concepts, and in a way I used the volume pedal and all that kind of stuff. So it would just all of a sudden I go, did I play that or did he play that? Or I've been on stage with other people like that, where especially also doing more ambient laptop guitar stuff with other players, where I'm playing it and I'm going, is that me or is that them? Or they were sampling me and sending me back.
Exactly.
And it's great. It really is, and that is the goal. You're absolutely right. So I was going to ask you. I was listening to the podcast with you and Mark Wingfield, and I did interview him for the magazine at one point. But I was going to ask you about the podcast. Was that did that come to be in part because of COVID, or kind of take off because of COVID, just as something to do?
Uh, yeah, it was clearly a COVID project. Um, so like like my background is that I'm sort of like a very much a very withdrawn person, actually. I need solitude to survive. It's my food, like I really need that. I'm not a very social person. I'm good with people, I like people, I love people, but I need my alone time, right? So what happened, what I started realizing once I knew I'm not going to play shows for a long time, I realized, and just in hindsight, okay, but like the meeting the people at shows, meeting the audience, having some sort of like human interaction is very important in order for people to enjoy what I do artistically. This was like a major thing I learned in the past 10, 11 years, ever since I started playing more shows, that the music alone is not enough. Right? So I have been in the situation where I can go out and play and meet people, and people start realizing, oh, maybe Marcus, I heard like people describe my music as cold and stuff like in the early days, and I was saying, but I'm not a cold person at all. So it just means like that I'm creating like a music that sort of is like a shiny chrome covered object, right? That some people may experience as cold, but actually I'm a warm person making that with my own hands, and in my hands it's actually a warm surface, right? Like so you see, and so but I realized once people meet me in the flesh, they understand. They understand the music better. And really what happened, because we were in Japan with Stickmen and Gary Husband when the lockdown started in Japan, and so we only played one show there. I experienced Tokyo being empty and stuff like that before any lockdown was happening here in Europe. So I went back and I already knew this is going to be a major thing. It's going to be take much longer than we think. So I knew that, and I just somehow things developed into the direction of I do want to have that social interaction. I want to reconnect with my peers, people I haven't talked to in 10 years. Um, I would like to make that public. I don't want to introduce anybody. I don't want to edit anything. This was sort of like the core idea. And it started out like the first person I talked to was Sean Crowder, a drummer that I was then working with. He learned touch guitar from me. Then I spoke to Sid Smith, Kavus Tarabi, and blah blah, and on and on. Now I have 81 podcasts recorded, and I slowed down considerably this year. But as I said, like the main, in hindsight, purpose of it was to reconnect and to show myself as a human being, and show the guests as human beings, so that their audiences don't lose contact with them, and so that they still see the humanity also behind the business, behind the need to actually earn a living. So that's why the podcast and these things, they are free to people, but they are also meant to somewhat educate them to see, okay, there's a human being there that's struggling, that can't really go on the road anymore, for example. So show your support, but it not as a begging. It's not an action of begging. It's like showing the reality and being human, and leading a, just like our conversation, like I don't see this as an interview, like, even though like you would have questions for me, but I'm talking to you as a friend. It's like,
Well, that's the way I like to do it too. I mean, I don't like to do just question answer stuff. I mean, the reason we're talking is because we're both interested in the same things, and I have things to say about it and you have things to say about it, and we can work off of each other. In your interview with Mark Wingfield, you said something interesting, that you guys had been playing together remotely, but without latency somehow. And I was curious is that the case, and how did you do that? Because that's been the holy grail all through the lockdown.
it is. Uh, so Michael, the thing is that we don't care if there's latency, because like, just like what I was saying about like feedback loops, right? Like, you have a feedback matrix. It's impossible to understand what's going on because it's just too complex. It's too complex with the way that we use. I can't even remember the name of the software right now. Audio Movers is the company. So we use this a plugin in our DAW to send our output to the other person, and then I receive his subgroup of his parts back on my end. So it's a loop. So it's a feedback loop already, but on the level of, like, he hears me, I hear him. I respond to what I hear. He responds to what he hears. We don't need to know what the latency is, because we just respond to what we hear. And so maybe we will never be able to recreate what actually happened, right? But we know that if we then import the files that we record remotely, we import them into one session, we know that they are played in response to each other, and that's what counts. I mean, I know it is possible to get things even lined up with a click and stuff if you allow for enough buffering, so enough, you kind of like both sides decide on having 30 seconds of latency, for example, right? And there are systems that do that so that you can actually play in time with each other. But for us, it was more interesting to put ourselves into the void, let's say, or the vacuum of a feedback loop, not knowing what's happening. And the music has come out amazing. It's just like, I think for me, it's the duo recordings, the remote recordings with Mark are one of the most amazing things I've ever done. Really.
Wow. Well, so it's not time-based music. In other words, there isn't a click, you're basically, responding to what the other person's doing. Because I have seen there were a bunch of quote unquote ambient electronic players playing together. They didn't do it, they didn't broadcast it live, but they did play together live and then record all of that and broadcast it. But there is nobody playing a drum groove, there's no click, there's no rhythmic elements to it. So people have been able to do that. I was just wondering if you had figured out a way to do
There is
the time thing.
there's software that does that, and I actually read about it last week again. It's Ohmforce is a company that did some really nice plugins,
Yeah, I know
and
that.
they have a DAW that does allow that kind of collaboration in time. I read about that last week.
Yeah,
So
I'd be interested because I mean,
yeah,
many years ago, I was invited to a press thing for some company that was claiming to be able to do that, and they had the guy just in the other room, and the latency was off. They weren't playing together, so
yeah,
apparently, a lot of it can. But there, I know I've heard some jazz guys have been doing it. A lot of it depends on how close you are, how good your internet connection is, and there's all sorts of factors, but within certain limits that it has been able to be done. I'm curious about your compositions that for other instruments like Sun Trance, which is done by vibraphone, glockenspiel, something called crotals or crotals. It's like a group of small tuned
yes,
cymbals. How do you pronounce that? Is it do you
Crotalis, yeah.
Crotalis? Do you hear those instruments in your head when you're composing it, or do you work with samples to get a sense of how they're going to work together and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I always have some sort of idea how things are gonna sound, how they're gonna work, and that's basically because I have a long history of musical education and making music myself. But um, I'm very much also a conceptual composer in the sense that I'm just kind of like interested in how certain pitches interact, even independently of the actual timbre that's going to play the notes, right? So like maybe the best example here is the string quartet that I've written, where in the whole process of writing the string quartet, obviously I could always imagine how it would sound played with real strings. But in the process, I never try to play it back with a string sound. Like, like when you're writing music and there's such temptation to press play and let the software kind of like try to mimic a string quartet. I never did that. I kind of like just chose a bell patch, a very simple bell patch from a synth to play the tunes, to play the music, because I didn't even want to hear it uh, with the potential sound. Like, because I think that, and this is the magic of music and the magic of musical performance and of good, good people that interpret music is they will always add to it. That you can, like any great composition on paper will be much greater when performed. It's a no-brainer, but and so like in my approach to composition, this is very important that I also take the musician seriously. So for example, like there's a lot in music education which I find really difficult in jazz education, also in composition education and orchestration and stuff, where people have their rule books, like where there's like things are about like how you should do them because then they work. But then the question is like, what do they need to work for? In order to recreate the sound of samba as it was played in the 1930s, you need A, B, C, D, F, G. You need to make sure you're not using that kind of instrument, you're not using that kind of voicing, blah blah blah. Everything can be kind of like put down into that recipe book, like as we're saying, even for food, right? And what happens then is that you will get a certain dish that is tasty, and where you can, as you said, you can taste the individual elements, but it's also maybe a little bit boring, and that's sort of like I'm not personally I'm not interested in that. And that's why I take the musicians as the core ingredient in music seriously, to let them bring in what they do best. So I let them make musical decisions as well. So for example, like there's like some people are obsessed with writing dynamics markings in their scores. Like I believe that if the musician listens in the performance, knows very well when to play louder or softer. It's about like blending in to the flow of the composition. You see what I mean? See what I mean, right? So for me, it's more important to write a composition that suggests a flow and a reaction than to kind of like say, okay, here you need to play softer, here you need to play louder, accelerando there or decelerando there, or like it for me it is important that the musicians are taken seriously, and in the performance when I'm there for the recording, let's say, I give them the freedom to unlock the composition, and then when they have a certain opinion, I say yes, do it that way. I have even then changed the scores later and written, the things into the score that the musicians did.
Yeah, well, that's those are choices that composers make. I mean, there's various degrees of autonomy that composers like to give, their players. I mean, in jazz, sometimes a piece will be written out completely. Sometimes it'll be just indicated. Sometimes, I mean, and in various, all sorts of scores will be more or less. But yeah, so that makes sense. You mentioned Brazilian music, which neatly segues into one of your latest projects, which is
Mhm.
the Brazilian project. I can't remember the exact name
Yeah,
at the moment, but
yeah, it's Mata Atlantica.
yeah. And how did that come about? And could you describe it, what it is?
Yeah, it comes out of a partnership with a friend who is a patron of the arts, and he has visited the Brazilian rainforest. I think like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and he's part of a reforestation I don't know how you call that, so they're reforesting the rainforest there, and he was very impressed by that, and he said he wanted to have a musical project that A could kind of like raise some funds for that organization, but B that also sort of like is a response um, to that crisis, you could say, in humanity, which it lit in the end it is like you're killing something off and then you're trying to recreate it, and it's a big challenge, and so he came to me and said, Marcus, let's do a project just based on this, and there was like really nothing there other than the wish to create something, and so we were talking about like which kind of musicians would we like to get involved, and we made a list of about 35, 40 people, and like I have a huge network of musicians I know, and then there was the idea, okay, so maybe let's just start from some Brazilian rhythms, but not let's not take the Brazilian rhythms like in the traditional way. And so I say, okay, why not ask my friend Tobias Reber, who is a Max uh, programmer from Switzerland? Why don't we ask him to kind of like create some sort of like electronic translation of those rhythms, and he was free to do anything, so they wouldn't even have to have any resemblance. But he found a way. He found a translation basically of the samples that we sent him into some basic electronic tracks, which were, funnily enough, not really using any Brazilian sounds. It was mostly tuned gongs and uh, stuff like that. And he sent this back to us, and then the process started for me to sort of like sift through the material he sent. Basically, I usually mostly accepted anything as what it is, maybe adjusted a little thing here and there, and I added a little bit of a compositional idea on top. Then I sent that off to the bass player Raphael, and at the same time to Gary Husband as a keyboard player in this case. And those guys sent me material back, and so it was like the whole project was built in layers, where my task was to collage the whole thing, right? But also and this was my approach there, to not question their contributions at all. So it was just like almost like a like you could say free improv, but within a context where each person was just allowed to be who he or she wanted to be, and without the producer actually censoring anything. So that's what that project is. And the funny thing is that I really didn't end up playing anything on 5 of the 6 tracks, or because I didn't need to. Um, but it's a wonderful project. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's
Oh yeah,
really it's
absolutely. I
special.
was going to say, yeah, it's amazing that first of all, given your description of how it came together, that it's as cohesive. It's amazingly cohesive. Not only that, one thing that struck me was how the acoustic sounds and the electronic sounds just blended beautifully. And I also noticed that you didn't play anything. Is that? But that's you on the last kind of quote unquote ambient track. The last, it sounds like
Yes,
a lot of kind of
yes.
electronic guitar type swells and stuff on it. But yeah, the whole thing works just beautifully together. Um, One thing I was going to ask you, well, I was watching some Anchor and Burden videos, and in recent years, you work with Asaf Circus, is that his name? And
Yeah.
Fabio
Yes.
Fantini. You've kind of like the opposite of mellowed. I mean, given your beginnings in more long tone ambient stuff, it seems like, now
Yeah.
for want of a better word, you've become kind of shreddy in on some of these projects. And I was wondering what that came from. Is it possibly a response to the times that call for more angsty music, or something personal, or how's it work?
Uh, no, like this is something didn't mention before. Like I actually come, as I said, I come from the contemporary classical world, but I also come from free improv. Like when I was 19, I joined a free improvising orchestra called the Chaos Orchestra, and it was at university in Bielefeld, Germany. And so I'm totally a child of the 60s when it comes to noise and not repeating yourself. And like, it's very much part of my DNA. And I was always like that, right? It's like I'm totally a gestural player, very, very much so. And punk, like I don't, I can still completely zone out of all my musical knowledge and just simply move my fingers, right, and my body. And I have to say it is really thanks to Leonardo Pavkovic of Moonjun Records, who sort of like took me under his wings, and like he said to me, he said, I mean, and he does that publicly, which is sometimes like really not nice for me, but he just calls me one of the greatest guitarists of all time and stuff like that. And he says, but Marcus, you need to show it to people. Like he says, like, and then he said, I give you, like, here, I give you an opportunity, like, go into the studio with Asaf, and you choose a bass player, and you actually record an album showing people that you can play, right? And that's what happened with the album called Truce. Uh, it was actually sort of like a joke because there's a website that is called The Truth in Shredding. That's why I came up with the name Truce then, because it was about the shredding. Because Leo said, Marcus, I want you to shred, right? And so that's really how it went. And that album turned out, Truce turned out amazing because it's really yeah. Like Leonardo gave me opportunity. He said you should really show people how you can play, how you can improvise, how great your hearing is, how you can respond, how the musicians can listen and create something in the moment. And that aggressive part of it, like it was always there. It was just that I didn't have, like I said, I didn't have an opportunity. And I'm also not somebody who is really interested in starting from a point like Leonardo's, like where it says, okay, do something that's flashy. I'm not interested in that. It's not my artistic interest to do something like that. But having him there and helping with that, it certainly opened a new door. And with Anchor and Burden, there's like I'm really looking forward to giving you that full album that new one that we're going to put
Uh,
out as a CD also now. It's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. It's and it has another touch guitarist, Alexander, who is my student on it. And it really is, I think coming back to the beginning of where we started, we're at a point now where the touch guitar is not the toy anymore that it used to be, especially with the Chapman stick, where it's just where it's only good for one sound or for one voicing almost, like, which is really like sad about the stick. But there it suggests like three, four different voicings, and it's at the stage of the equivalent of playing an E major and G major and C major chord on an acoustic guitar, really. It hasn't developed from there. I've been talking openly to you about this. It's really true. Um, the touch guitar, this technique that I've developed over the years, it just it allows people to play actual music, to play in the tradition of great improvisers, um, like the idea that you can create real music instantly. Um, and as you said, like it's sort of like an interesting in between, kind of almost like a trance instrument, right? Like trance with S, you know. So it can be a guitar, it can be a keyboard, can be a bass, it can be played in a very textural way, it can be played. Um, you can do anything you want with it, and I'm glad that Leonardo kind of like helped me to build a little bit of a platform to do that, gave me opportunity to play with Mark Wingfield. And Mark and I, we are best friends. Like we have such a intense musical partnership. Um, it's just wonderful.
well, that's great. Well, yeah, and that actually not neatly segues into my last question. You played with Mark, you played with Adrian Belew, played with Tim Moetzer, Robert Fripp. Are there any other quote unquote more traditional guitarists that you can see yourself doing a project with or would like to do a project with in a perfect world?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I I'm not drawing satisfaction anymore out of um, like what a lot of people do is like sort of like the name dropping aspect of this, right? So I'm not interested, I would not be interested in playing with anybody else just because of their name. So this is important. I know that you didn't ask that,
No, I mean,
but this
I'm more interested in, are there any unknown players you've discovered, playing quote unquote traditional guitar that are blowing you away that you would like to do something with?
yes. So for me, it's very much about I have like my own community, let's say, of people that that for whatever reason come and want to work with me or want to know me as a friend, and I'm very much interested in deepening my relationships with my people. And there is no name dropping there. It doesn't make sense, even though I could give you a few names, right? Like my student Eric Eskilsson, amazing guitarist, amazing sonic visionary, I think, when it comes to guitar-based ambient music, ambient, yeah. Um, yes, and I'm deepening my relationships there in terms of like the idea of sort of like collaboration as with some sort of uh, I don't want to even use this word, like business consideration. Yeah,
Oh, no, 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 no.
obviously, but you know what I mean, like that's kind of like the kind of name dropping, or that's the kind of collaborations that in the business what that people do, and we are not interested. I'm not interested in that. You know, my biggest influence and like the composer, not the person that because I don't know him, that I admire most is still Mike Oldfield. Like he's done so much for the world of music, and he's done it in almost in a vacuum. He's done it against all odds, and he's done it with huge success. like huge success. Like there's this little interesting story that I need to share with you. So Adrian Belew, very good friend of mine, huge famous guy, like has made music for a long time. He sings a song on the Mike Oldfield album, which is considered to be one of Mike's least interesting records, Earth Moving, right? In 1989. And the single with Adrian is being released. And it's this single one of the least successful albums of Mike Oldfield is the biggest success that Adrian Belew ever had. The biggest selling record Adrian ever had. And this is just something that I find so incredibly interesting. There's somebody like Mike Oldfield that I consider to be an outsider, like somebody who is not very popular. But then you see, like within the industry, that there is like this huge numbers game, let's say, in a
Well,
way, right?
yeah,
That's
I mean, Mike Oldfield had a top 40 hit. I don't know that Adrian ever did, as well known as he is among guitarists and sort of prog
yeah.
rock fans. Mike Oldfield had Tubular Bells, and so at one point, it's amazing how those hits can carry you through the years in terms of name recognition.
Yes, yes. But what I was gonna say, like in terms of like playing guitar or playing with somebody, like I'm more interested in if we're talking about names, I'm more interested in having a conversation and with which I already had many times with David Torn, or with I would really love to meet Mike at some point, but I would not want to meet him in order to make music with him. I would like him to sort of like maybe tell me a few stories, or like I would like to, I don't even would want him to mentor me actively or anything, because I'm not in a position to ask for that, right? But that's sort of like what I'm interested in. Like as an artist, as a player, I don't need any outside um, approval or any outside motivation, or I don't have that kind of dream anymore. And I think that's a good thing for the art, like there's the motivation has become purer and purer over the years, which is sort of like a surprise to me because as a young person, you don't know what kind of path you're gonna come on. And for me, I feel there's very little I'm still dreaming about or of, and it's a good thing.
That is a great thing. I mean, it's just, I was just approaching it from a fantasy thing and not even guitarists. I mentioned guitarists because it's a guitar magazine, but I mean, just like when I think about a fantasy of who I would love to play with, because I feel that, the music I love, their music, and I feel the way I play might be able to help them, not help, but just add something to their music would be something like Joni Mitchell, because I've played with
Yeah,
singer-songwriters in that vein and I love doing it. And she's the ultimate apotheosis of a songwriter in that vein. So I was
yeah.
asking more in that
But
spirit.
for me in that spirit, it's very clear. I do want partnerships with great musicians in the classical tradition and contemporary classical tradition also, who would be interested in making my music come alive, so that I could write for them or they could interpret pieces that I've already written. And I have an orchestral piece, Modern 513 already, um, which I got lucky that it actually got performed. Um, I mentioned the string quartet. I just recently wrote for harp, funnily enough. Uh, and I would really love to have more opportunities to bring my musical out there in a sort of like orchestral format. So what I mean is by that is like a big body of sound, right? Like that's sort of like the dream that I certainly still have.
Well,
But there, I don't have names. It could be. I don't know. I don't. And this is actually one of my students. She's the principal flautist in the Houston Symphony Orchestra, and and I've heard their performances, and they're outstanding, like amazing. Like if I could ever have an ensemble like that play my music, that would be just incredible.
Well, here's hoping, and it's not too late. But it's been great talking to you, Marcus. I'm sorry I would put it off this long, but we'll do it again at some point.
I'm very pleased to finally have met you, and like I've realized, like I had never even seen your face like this. I mean, I saw probably like the a few photos with prehaps somewhere or something, but that's about it, you know.
Well, it is great talking to you, and I'm going to sign off the interview now, but we can talk for a second afterwards. And thanks
Okay,
again.
you're welcome.